It's a rum sport, rock climbing. Incomprehensible to most folk, irresistible to some. It's usually uncomfortable, often strenuous, sometimes terrifying. The penalty for a mistake can be high, life or limb.
Give us a bit slack, Jerry.
In fact, it's not as dangerous as it looks. Rock climbers look for the hard ways up, then go to a lot of trouble to make them as safe as possible. The second man paying out the rope is fixed to the rock, belayed, so he can't be pulled off. And as he climbs, the leader fixes what are called running belays, anchors to the rock to which the climbing rope is attached, so that if he falls, he won't fall far, in theory.
Be careful, yeah. There's nothing positive, you know, everything's not greasy.
Yeah.
It's got to be pretty dynamic, this.
Well, it's not dynamic, this one.
It's called free climbing, using nothing but the rock itself to climb on. The special gear and techniques are not to help the climbing, simply to make it safer. And they work. They've saved countless lives. They've taken 100 years and more to evolve.
I always feel ashamed putting them in. So
Why
good,
not?
that one. It's a real
Greasy.
stopper. Huh?
Looking greasy.
That's solid, that one.
Not as well put them in.
Climbers grow evasive when they're asked why they enjoy it. They take Louis Armstrong's line when someone asked him what jazz was. If you have to ask, you'll never know. The leader here is Dave MacDonald from Tyneside. The climb's called Innominate Crack. When the leader's at the top and firmly belayed, the second man, this is Jerry Waters of Keswick, follows and retrieves the gear. It's expensive. Most people think it's an unnatural way of enjoying yourself. Climbers, of course, say it's the most natural thing in the world. Either way, although it's a minority sport, it commands a passionate following in many parts of the world. It all began here just over 100 years ago at this little valley head, Wasdale Head, in the English Lake District. There were several good reasons. In the first place, it's well off the normal tourist beat through the Lake District, a fairly remote valley. But there was a hotel here in those days, quite a large one, and it had a man called Dan Tyson as its landlord, and he was a very tolerant, hospitable man. But the chief reason is that this valley head lies within easy reach of three great climbing grounds. Pillar Rock, the only sizable summit in the whole district that you can't reach without using your hands and feeling a sense of a big drop underneath your feet, was very popular with the pioneer climbers. Then, presiding over this Wasdale Valley head, Great Gable, and just beneath the summit, the range of the Napes Crags, which was very popular with them too. And to the south of here, just 2 hours walking away, the highest mountain in England, Scawfell Pikes, and alongside that, the biggest climbing crag in England, Scawfell Crag itself. Geologists call the rock round here Borrowdale volcanic. It's hard and on the whole reliable, and it's greatly given to the vertical. It was this fact, more than anything else, that made this area the adventure playground of the pioneer rock climbers. It was these gentlemen, Victorian, middle-class professional men, who invented or organized into their modern forms nearly all the sports with which the world now amuses itself. Tennis, Queensberry rules, boxing, cricket, soccer, and rugger. And the more adventurous spirits among them looked for less regulated, more dangerous games to play. Small boat sailing was just coming in. Potholers had just started to go underground. In the Alps, men had been climbing the mountains there, the snow and ice mountains, for more than 20 years. Walter Parry Haskett Smith is known as the father of English rock climbing. He was a classic student at Oxford when he first came to Wasdale Head on a summer reading party. They read Plato and Aristotle in the mornings, then explored the fells off the beaten tracks. And he enjoyed it so much he was back again the next year, 1882, to make several new routes up the cliffs. The very first routes that Haskett Smith made in the Lakeland were in gullies in places like this. He was often on his own, sometimes with a friend, but even when there were two of them, they didn't use a rope, although it had been in general use in alpine climbing for many years by then. Haskett Smith thought there was something illegitimate, he said, about taking a rope onto the crags. In the very early years, that was. And he once said, the rope merely enables the bag climber to get into places where none but the good climbers have any business to be. There was something about the enclosing walls of the gullies that gave him a greater sense of security in those very first days, though it was an entirely illusionary thing. In fact, Lakeland gullies are notorious for being wet, slimy, cold, miserable, uncomfortable, and rather dangerous places. Large pieces come away all the time. There's a lot of debris, a lot of slimy vegetation like that. Nowadays, you don't find many climbers in places like this. Local men began to take an interest. John Wilson Robinson of Lawton and George Seatree of Penrith had a camping holiday in 1885 and took a rope with them, an alpine rope. When they took it to Wasdale Head, Dan Tyson, the landlord, asked if there was going to be a hanging job on. The rope was soon in general use, but by modern standards, deplorably deployed. They all climbed at once. No one bothered to belay, tie himself to the rock so he couldn't be pulled off. They had only one rule: the leader must not fall. The fact that they were roped together meant it would be just as well if no one else fell either. It was very much a case of one off, all off. In 1882, Haskett Smith and John Wilson Robinson were exploring along here at the foot of Napes Crags on Great Gable, and they came across this slender, odd-shaped little pinnacle, Napes Needle. 4 years after that, towards the end of June 1886, Haskett Smith was here on his own and decided to have a go. Bill Peascod used modern gear to follow Haskett Smith's original route. He needed it. It was a wild day.
Hang in there, Phil. Hang in there.
No, dear. Shit, I'm brick. No, bloody hell. Now this is where we're getting into real trouble.
Yeah.
This bloody corner here.
Looks really touchy and wet up there.
This part of the climb was harder when Haskett Smith did it solo. He'd a better day for it, but the crack was full of pebbles and vegetation which have long since been cleared away. And he only had country boots and no protection at all. The whole climb's not more than 60 feet, but it's steep and varied and exposed. They were out of the gullies with a vengeance. It's arguably the most significant short climb ever made, not so much for the climb itself, but for the interest it attracted.
It's absolutely bloody lousy.
The top bit's harder now. Thousands of passing boots have worn the small holds away.
I'll lift my bloody cap to Haskett Smith.
Whose idea was this?
It's just all incredible bloody shit. Absolutely incredible shit.
I wouldn't bother with a headstand, Bill.
It's a highly photogenic flake, and photographs of climbers on it did more than anything else to attract new recruits to the new sport. A community grew up. At Christmas, Easter and Whitsun, the hotel was taken over by the climbers. They were on holiday. They'd climb anything, anyhow. This route on a nearby boulder had to be done upside down. Just outside the hotel, there was a famous route, the Barn Door Traverse, demonstrated here by a Manchester doctor, Joseph Collier. The spectator was a classics teacher. They were professional men, mostly from the cities, well-educated and well-heeled. They climbed hard, in all weathers. The Lake District's good at all weathers. It was a unique community, highly charged, vigorous, convivial. They dumped their gear in the lobby each evening. The place stank of drying tweeds. This was the entrance hall, Easter 1895. This is the hotel entrance today. Not greatly changed from the early days. This hotel's very conscious of the important role it played in the story of Lakeland climbing, and it's still a very popular resort for climbers. For 20 years and more, in the 1880s and 1890s, it was virtually an all-male community. I suspect that many of them wanted simply to get away for a brief holiday spell from the rigid conventions that ruled Victorian domestic life at that time. For the most part, they were practical, straightforward men with none of the religious, mystical attitudes of the alpine mountaineers of the time, and very little of the kind of poetic romanticism of their Snowdonia contemporaries. They described their crags as a veritable rock gymnasium and talk about the routes they've made as interesting or presenting a nice little problem. They were competitive, of course, but not intensely so. And the thing they hated most of all was boasting, showing off. When they made a new route, they'd come to the hotel in the evenings and write it up in the hotel book very briefly. But some of them wouldn't even do that. It's clear from their writings that they thought of themselves as a kind of elite, a chosen, if slightly crazy company. And they gloried in the fact that many people thought they were daft. They felt special. And they were special in a way. They were going into places where men had never been before them and testing themselves against danger and the force of gravity. By the early 1890s, they were making impressive routes. Moss Gill, the hardest gully on Scawfell Crag, was conquered by a distinguished Scottish scientist, Professor Norman Colley. Dr. Collier of Manchester found a way over the nose on the long north climb on Pillar Rock. They weren't climbing simultaneously anymore, but their rope work was still dangerously primitive. Sometimes they'd pass a rope hopefully over a flake. No one belayed. Their boots were specially nailed by this time. They argued much about the best alignment of the nails. And they made great use of what they called combined tactics, using each other's backs and sometimes heads as footholds. In April 1892, a solicitor from Merseyside, Godfrey Solly, made a breakthrough. His route on Great Gable, Eagle's Nest Ridge Direct, is still graded very severe, mild. It was the first climb of that standard ever accomplished. It's a delicate route and very exposed. An old climber once described it to me as a great test of one's serenity, by which he meant that if you keep calm, you'll do it. If you panic, you'll fall off.
I'll see if I can get a little nut in here somewhere. Ah, there's one.
On the first ascent, of course, they didn't have the reassurance of modern protection. Today, a man who made such a breakthrough would be called a tiger, a leading lead climber. Godfrey Solly would have hated that. He was a modest man, and this climb so impressed him and his three companions that on the way down they seriously discussed whether or not they should mention it at all in the hotel book. They finally decided to do so but with a warning that no one should try it without careful reconnaissance beforehand. That too is very different from today's tigers, who publish promptly when they make a new route. A few women were showing an interest. They'd been active in alpine mountaineering for many years, but they weren't making new routes. In 1890, a woman reached the top of Nape's Needle, but it was still basically a man's game. The ladies weren't helped by their dress, especially the heavy full-length skirts that decorum demanded. In the early 1890s, a new man, Owen Glyn Jones, a science teacher, brought a new spirit, more assertive and swashbuckling than his predecessors. He was short-sighted. Haskett Smith said that if Jones could have seen the routes he was making, he wouldn't have gone anywhere near them. But he was gymnastic and very strong, especially in the arms and hands. He trained hard and climbed whenever he could. He was a first rock climber fanatic. And he'd climb with anyone. He teamed up with the brothers George and Ashley Abraham, who were professional photographers from Keswick. Most of these early pictures were theirs. This is Curving Crack on Scawfell Pinnacle, taken in April 1896, and the first picture of a new route being made in Lakeland. Ashley Abraham took the picture. His brother George assumed a dynamic posture halfway up, with Jones on a little ledge above. "We composed our limbs," Jones wrote, "to a photographic quiescence. The gill had become rather gloomy, and we had a lengthy exposure." One of Owen Glyn Jones' classic contributions to climbing in the Lake District was Cernot's Crack here on the flanks of Great Gable. John Wilson Robinson thought the climb was unjustifiable, too dangerous, and he told Jones that if he attempted to climb it and climbed it, he'd never speak to him again. But Jones was a very determined man, and he had several attempts on this route and finally conquered it in April 1897. This is a bit Jones found hardest. He tried standing on a friend's shoulders, then he did it protected by a rope from above. Finally, he did it without protection.
It's a little bit wet, Jerry, so just watch it. I think it'll be better in the crack, actually. It's greasy, but at least you've got some security.
Right.
If you can get started. Here we go. No. Just slide down it. No. That's too slimy.
Even with all the comfort of modern protection, it was a struggle for Dave MacDonald. This is another route that's grown harder over the years as the passage of countless boots has smoothed off the holes and removed some of them completely.
Jerry. No. It's just... Watch us. Jerry.
Cernot's Crack is today graded very severe mild. It was Jones who invented the adjectival grading system for climbs. He proposed 4 categories: easy, moderate, difficult, exceptionally severe. He put this route in the top category.
It is wet.
Jones had 4 grades. Today there are 16, more than half of them above this standard.
Okay, Jerry.
Okay.
O.G. Jones was killed in a climbing accident in the Alps in 1899. But there were new men now, and a new style of climbing had emerged, what they called balance climbing. dependent on smooth movement and the careful use of the feet on tiny holes rather than brute strength. The new style found its finest expression on Botterill slab on Scawfell. Fred Botterill, a Yorkshireman trained on Pennine gritstone, made the first ascent in June 1903. He was roped to a companion, but it amounted in effect to a solo climb. He had no protection. He wore nailed boots and carried an ice axe in his teeth part of the time. He paused once to raise his hat to a lady passing along the path 80 feet below. The route still graded very severe. It was the first of that standard ever made in England. Rock climbing had come of age. It had been practiced in the Lake District for 21 years, and in all that time, despite the advance in standards and the still primitive nature of their protection methods, not one life had been lost in Lakeland climbing. This proud record came to an abrupt, brutal end just a few weeks after Botterill had made his very bold new route. This cross, cut in the rock at the bottom of Scawfell Pinnacle Face, marks a spot at which 4 young men fell to their deaths. It gives the date, September the 21st, 1903, and the initials of the young men. It was a wild, blustery day in autumn, and it seems, from the records that have survived, that the leader grew tired about 140 feet up this crag and asked the second man to move in and take over the lead. And it was while the second man was moving past him that he slipped and fell and pulled the other 3 men down with him to their deaths. Not one of them was belayed, tied to the rock behind him, or else all their lives might well have been saved. The accident gave a terrible jolt to the sport in Lakeland. All the early climbers knew it was a dangerous game they were playing. They must have been very careful, as well as very good climbers, to have gone on for as long as they did, climbing routes of increasing severity without any fatal accidents. But it's one thing to know about the danger, it's something else again when something like this happens. And for several years after that, the sport in Lakeland faltered. And it was several years, for example, before anyone climbed Botterill Slab again. In 1907, a club was formed, the Fell and Rock Climbing Club of the English Lake District. Until then, the climbing community had been informal. Now it became organized, though loosely, and the stress was on safety. Even so, just before the outbreak of the First World War, the district resumed its leadership in the sport with a remarkable climb. In April 1914, 2 young climbers climbed a new route here on Scawfell Crag called Central Buttress, which has been described as probably the biggest single breakthrough in standard in the whole history of Lakeland climbing. It's a route which modern climbers, with all their special new techniques and gear, still regard with the greatest respect. And the hard part, the crux of the climb, is on what they call the Great Flake. The first ascent was made by a research engineer called Siegfried Herford and a scientist, George Sansom. They approached the problem with scientific thoroughness, making several reconnaissance climbs before Herford finally led it without the security of a rope from above him. At the hardest point, the chopped stone and above it, they used combined tactics. Sansom climbed close behind and allowed Herford to use his shoulders and hands as supplementary footholds. Nowadays, it's done by a technique called layback. Dave MacDonald demonstrates. It was nearly 20 years after the first ascent before the climb was done free, without assistance at the Chockstone. Central Buttress was another breakthrough. Another new grade was created for it. Hard, very severe. Climbers remember their history. Sig Cross, who started climbing in 1928 and ran a popular climbers' pub for many years and still climbs at the age of 70, assesses the achievements of the pioneers.
You know, when you look at these crags of ours in Lakeland, when you look at Scawfell and Pillar and see the roots there, you think of the pioneers of Lakeland climbing, the Haskett Smiths, Solly, Broderick, Bottrill and these people. And you compare the equipment that they have had with the present day equipment. They were almost naked compared to today. Pair of boots, on most occasions just hobnails, maybe 80 feet of rope, and heavy rope too. And we see such climbs as Bottrill Slab, first ascended solo too. And of course, the Pinnacle Face routes of O.G. Jones, incredible routes, exposure, bold routes. And there must have been very, very bold men that ascended them in the first place. These were the routes first done when man came out of the gullies and the chimneys which had been climbed, which were enclosed to a large extent and gave a feeling of safety. And the boldness was coming out right out onto the face of Scawfell, of the Pinnacle Face. And then we came right up to the central buttress route, which today, even our tigers of today, would pay great respects to. And this is a great thing that today, even the hardest lads of today would look back and say, they were great fellas with ours.
Rock climbing's come a very long way since the start of the First World War 70 years ago. As in all sports that can be measured objectively by time or distance, or as in this case by sheer technical severity, people are doing things now that folk of 1 or 2 generations ago would have regarded as beyond human ability. This is what rock climbing looks like now, in the 1980s, towards the outer limits of the sport. Pete Williams has been one of the leading Lakeland climbers for many years.
Have you got anything there?
No, I can't find any runners in the corner here.
His usual companion is Dave Armstrong, an architectural technician. They both come from Carlisle. Williams works as a scaffolder. He's on a route on Raven Crag above Thirlmere, which is called Relay, and graded extremely severe 3. On the day we filmed this, conditions were bad enough to push it up a couple more grades.
A poor rock in the corner here. I don't hold much hope for it though.
Yeah. Okay. We'll watch them.
Protection's all important. The old rule that the leader must not fall no longer holds. Lead climbers expect to fall, frequently, and rely on their running belays to catch them. It's a slow, methodical business. Calmness is all. This is a vanguard of Lakeland rock climbing today, intensely dedicated and competitive.
It's as slippy as hell up here.
It's still free climbing, the gear's still for protection only, but it's a very long way from the scene 70 years ago. This film was shot in 1913. As far as I know, it's the earliest rock climbing film ever taken, and it's never been shown publicly before. The Abraham brothers of Keswick shot it, and it shows 2 climbers, possibly Hereford and Sansom, the conquerors of Central Buttress, making the top pitch of Nape's Needle look straightforward. Uncluttered by modern gear, not helped by modern protection. Many leading climbers were killed in the First World War. Each November since, on Remembrance Sunday, hundreds of people walked to the summit of Great Gable to remember those, Siegfried Herford was one of them, who did not come back. After the First War, despite its losses, Lakeland climbing resumed its preeminence. Rubber-soled shoes, lighter and more adhesive in dry conditions, came in. Sensible belaying became general. The layback technique evolved. Climbing guidebooks were published and there were one or two professional guides. The great creative names were H.M. Kelly, Maurice Linnell, Colin Kirkus, A.T. Hargreaves. The appearance of Jim Burkitt in the late 30s signalled the arrival of the working class. He was a local quarryman and very strong. He made many formidable routes, including the first in Britain that's still graded extremely severe. Then came Bill Peascod in the centre of this picture, who opened up many new routes and some new crags in the Buttermere area. Bill Peascod first climbed this route, Honister Wall on Buckstone How, which is graded hard severe, in 1948. And now, today, 40 years on nearly, he's going to repeat that route using much the same sort of gear as he used on the first ascent. Just a length of old hemp rope and nail boots. Not much else.
The old nails grip like buggery.
Doesn't do the rock much good.
They were using running belays by 1948, but they were crude. A loop of hemp rope with a snap link attached.
If you're trying to frighten me, you know, you're succeeding.
The whole climb's nearly 300 feet and it's divided into 6 sections, climbing pitches. This is a first pitch about 60 feet and it ends at what the modern guidebook calls a rather doubtful block belay.
I was hoping you wouldn't make it.
That's all faithful. I had him on the first ascent. Come you ready?
Righto, climbing.
Yep.
I think there's been a car toss up here by the look of the marks on the rock.
For Dave MacDonald, climbing in nail boots was a novel experience.
Suicide climbing this game.
Now, treat my dear old sling with respect.
Will I catch anything from this old sling, do you think?
You might catch a bubonic plague or something. I can't ever step across further. You please yourself.
I'll take the directing. I'm still trying to figure out how to use these boots. I'll pick it up. You ever tried climbing ice skates? Probably better than these things.
Was
It's quite
dating.
enjoyable.
Oh, yeah, great. I tell you what.
Once in a while. Once in a
Tell you
while.
what, it ought to be reintroduced, you know, for winter climbing. The hell with this running away looking for nice dry rock.
Oh, it'll be good on wet rock.
Oh, can you get it where? Just if you stand there, I think you'll be all right. Yeah. Yeah, you can tie under here if you like. There we are.
In 1952, Bill Peascod emigrated to Australia to teach mining engineering, to discover that he was highly talented as a landscape painter, and to carry on climbing. He made many new routes on the crags of New South Wales and Queensland.
It really is quite soft.
Oh,
in the
yeah.
mouth, isn't it?
It's almost like soapstone.
A few years ago, he came back to Cumbria, settled in an old farmhouse above Bassenthwaite, and renewed his special relationship with the Lakeland Crags.
What protection?
Aye. The ground will take the sting out of the fall.
My attitude towards climbing was that it's a holier-than-thou sport, and it was terribly precious. And I really discovered it through reading books. I didn't know anybody that climbed, and I just went to the lakes and quite by accident, even though I live 15 miles away. Discovered it one morning on a push bike and I started from then on.
On your own at first?
On my own, yes. Dragging a 50-foot rope up Crags behind me, hoping that he'd catch on to something.
But I mean, what was it about it that you enjoyed?
It just, something I could do. I felt, you know, this is it. This is of all the sports I tried to do and tried to achieve something. This was the one that I felt was a natural for me.
You were a coal miner in those days.
I went to work in the mines when I was 14, and I was working at the cliff face when I was, at the coal face when I was 18, and I suppose that made me strong. I used to fill 20 tubs full of coal every day, and I was very light in weight, so I suppose that it was some form of weight training.
But most climbers at that time were sort of middle-class chaps. Was there any sense of social resistance to you coming on the scene as a coal miner?
I don't think so, but it's difficult. It's a difficult one to answer this because, well, with all due modesty, and I'm not given to modesty, so I'm told, I was fairly competent. Therefore, this overcame any resistance there may well have been. I don't think it was there, but had I been less competent, say, there may well have been some resistance. I don't think so. But everybody I met was very kind.
What did your coal mining mates think of you going climbing?
Oh, that's bloody crazy. I kept it very quiet. I was terrified to let them know really that I did climb. And even in my hometown when I went climbing, and normally it was by bus or push bike, I used to hide the rope in the bottom, the rope and the boots in the bottom of the rucksack, in case somebody saw what I was doing. I was dreadfully afraid of being thought bonkers, but obviously I was bonkers and still am.
This is all the gear that the early climbers, the first rock climbers in Lakeland in the 1880s, had to take with them. A pair of boots, heavy they are, with heavily nailed in the bottom, like that. An ice axe, usually with a shaft about 4 feet long, like that. And 60 or 80 feet of hemp rope, tied at the end with what they call the first man's knot, a bowline. That's all they had with them. Now, the modern climber, it's an entirely different scene. Pete Williams, this is the sort of gear you now take with you when you're going climbing.
That's right, yes.
Can we do a conducted tour around it? First, starting
Certainly.
with your boots.
Well, the boots are high-friction rubber, close-fitting, usually with a stiffener in the sole, which are a very high frictional property.
And really very light.
Oh, yes, very light indeed, yes.
Yes, and going up then you've got a harness around your middle.
That's right, well, the harness is for comfort and also to spread the load in the event of a fall. And also in case you ended up in a position where you were hanging free on a rope. To hang free just around your waist will eventually strangle you. You know, you need this just for comfort.
Yeah. Now, what about all this stuff?
Well, where do we start?
Well, these are carabiners, aren't they, which are in great use.
The carabiner,
Snap
yes.
link,
Well, these
opens
nowadays
easily.
are hollow, lightweight carabiners.
Yeah.
These are short slings which we attach to the nuts, which come in all sizes from 32nd of an inch up to the biggest things we have here, which can go up to 6 inches.
Now, these are an even more recent development.
They're called Friends. Well, it has a trigger which is pulled, and the cams close.
You push
It is then inserted in a crack.
So it won't
And
come
because
out.
they are cams, it's impossible to release them. The harder you pull them, the more they jam.
Yeah. And you've got some chalk hanging from your waist there.
Of course, yes. Absolute must these days.
And
That's
that's
chalk back.
And that's for...
It's because your fingers will sweat on very small holes, the standard of climbing that they're doing today, and you're just climbing on your finger ends. The slightest amount of perspiration will make your hand slip and your fingers will come off. So the chalk came from America originally about 7 or 8 years ago, where it's far hotter there, but it's caught on. It was a bit controversial to start with, but now is used universally in the climbing world.
You just dip your fingers in there when you feel they're getting sweaty.
Dip your fingers in, yes, most of the time. actually.
And finally, the rope. I think that's about the last thing. What kind of length is that rope?
These are 150 foot.
Yeah.
Modern day climber uses 2. They're 9mm thick, about 5,000 pound breaking strain each, and he climbs with 2, so that can cut down on rope drag.
Yeah.
You clip carabiners to the right on one rope and those on the left in the other rope, and that way you reduce the drag on the rope.
Yeah. Pete Willens reckons his gear costs more than £400 and it's got to be renewed regularly. He does a lot of climbing every weekend and a couple of days each week if he can. The best training for climbing, he says, is climbing. But his job as a scaffolder helps to keep him fit and mentally attuned to height. He says the risk element enhances the sport for him. I asked if he ever has moments when he feels he can't go up and can't get down and is simply terrified.
There are occasions when you get a long way from protection, and obviously you are frightened, you are worried.
Have you had big falls?
I've had a couple of screamers, yes. At high-level climbing today, people do fall a lot, but the protection is that good that you can afford to do it. In some cases, on serious climbs, you can take long falls. I've fallen up to 120 feet, and it isn't too serious as long as you don't hit anything on the way down. Unfortunately, most of the climbing today is on very steep crags, and there's not much chance of hitting rock on the way down.
Yeah. So you were all right after 120 feet?
Well, in 17 years or 18 years, I've never had any serious injury. Maybe I've been lucky.
You're a very cool-mannered man, but you give your climbs some pretty hot names. Edge of Extinction, Desperado, Malice in Wonderland. Do you enjoy picking out names when you made a new route?
Well, it's quite a headache at times. It takes longer to think up the names than it does to do the climbs, but yes, it's all part of the game, part of the fun of it, yes.
Over the last 100 years or so, rock climbing's really advanced leaps and bounds, every generation doing things the generation before thought was impossible. It seems incredible that it can go on moving at that pace. And how do you see climbing developing in the next 10 years or so?
Well, technically, there is undoubtedly still room for improvement, and it still will get harder, I'm sure. It is easy for every generation to turn around and say, we must have reached the limit. But today, climbers have only just started to train really seriously at the sort of levels that athletes do. But there is still room for improvement. Climbers can still improve and will still climb technically harder. I can't see any end to it anyway, not at the moment.
Shepherd's Crag in Borrowdale is the most popular in the district. It's only a few minutes from the road, and though it's not high, it offers a wide range of routes, from the easiest to extremely severe. There is no climber stereotype. Men and women, heterosexual and homosexual, the long and the short and the tall, the slim and the not so slim, teenage beginners and old age pensioners, all ages and all classes. The only common factor is that they like to climb at or near the limits of their abilities. They tend to be independent spirited. There's a lot of organized instruction nowadays, and climbers dispute, sometimes fiercely, whether it's a good thing or not. Many believe such teaching, with its regulations and inevitable stress on safety, goes against the exploring, individualistic spirit of the game. The sport's seen many developments, but the basics haven't changed. The crags have scarcely altered in 100 years. It's still fundamentally a matter of confidence and control. Fitness and balance are important, but the most important thing by far is what's happening in the climber's mind. It's not and never will be a spectator sport. It's too slow, and the action's usually too distant. That's why it's not attracted to itself the public interest and big money that have dragged sports like soccer and tennis to their present depths of bad manners and bitchery. Sue Kaiso, an instructor at an outdoor pursuit centre, protected me up the first pitch of a well-known climb. This is a route called Little Chamonix on Shepherd's Crag, which was first climbed by the schoolmaster, Bentley Beetham, in 1946. He opened a lot of new crags and new routes in this area, the Borrowdale area. This is a very popular route. It's probably the most popular on the whole of this crag. It's graded V-diff, very difficult, so it's popular with children learning to climb, moving on to more desperate things, and also with aging climbers like me. You can go on climbing into old age, dropping grades as the limbs stiffen and the nerves slacken, but still feeling the old excitement. Enjoying, too, the incomparable views of Lakeland. Rock climbing gives you lots of time to stand and stare. There's a Keswick climber called Ray McHaffey who does this route for a bet, wearing roller skates and boxing gloves on his hands. Big stride across the right. Sometimes I have nightmares just thinking about this bit being done like that. Because the holes are there, but they're quite small and delicate. Sue led the last pitch, which must be the most photographed in England. Rock climbing looks and feels more dangerous than it is. Over the past 10 years, on average, only 2 people a year have been killed actually climbing in the Lake District. Most of the serious accidents happen to walkers. The first adventurer in these hills was Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet-philosopher. By sheer chance, he made the first rock climb in England 180 years ago. And he wrote, "I never find myself alone within the embracement of rocks and hills, but my spirit courses, drives and eddies like a leaf in autumn. The farther I ascend, the greater becomes in me the intensity of the feeling of life." Thanks very much, Sue.
Okay.
Climbers don't very often say what it is or about it that they enjoy. But when they do, they usually say something like, it makes them feel more intensely alive. Cynics might say they're just happy to have finished it and still be alive, but there's more to it than that. There is something about the sport that's invigorating and stimulating and enlivening. There are many thousands of keen rock climbers today, not just here in Lakeland, but on sea cliffs and outcrops and crags all over Britain, and not only in Britain, but all over the world as well. And the great majority of them still climb for the original reasons that inspired the pioneers, for escape and adventure, for fun, basically. And when the day's over, they still like to retire to a bar somewhere around a few pints of beer and talk about rock climbing.
There's a groove system there with huge overhangs, with huge grooves to the left. It's a big corner with...
To get up into that one, you climb up just slightly overhanging, and then you go out across the wall on the right. You're not pulling straight over a big overhang to get.
When it was just beginning here 100 years ago at Wasthill Head, rock climbing was a game for a handful of young men of the middle class. They had no idea what they were starting. Today it's a sport that's enjoyed by scores of thousands of people across the world. Not men only, certainly not the middle class only, not only the young. If those pioneers could come back and look at the sport today, they'd be amazed by what they saw, by the development of techniques, by the standards that are now climbed. But I think they'd recognize their sport, and I think they'd approve of it. It's still free climbing here without artificial aids. It's still done for their motive, for fun. And as Dr. Johnson said, though he wasn't talking about rock climbing, no man is a hypocrite in his pleasures.